Hello and welcome to another Total Education Centre lecture. Today I'm here to talk to you about Prospero, the main character and narrative driver in The Tempest. We're going to look at Prospero in terms of how his character changes and what we discover and what he discovers about him on the way through, and all those adaptations that we make. Don't forget to visit totaleducationcentre.com.au for all your educational needs. If you do like this video, please click the like button down below. That apparently helps us in our rankings. Alright, I'm going to frame the lecture a little bit by talking about Prospero initially. If we accept The Tempest raises questions about human limitations and possibilities, and that humans are multifaceted, then we can examine Prospero as an evolving, not a static character. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, how he needs to evolve in terms of theatre as well. What I want to do today is examine him very carefully from his initial desire to seek revenge to his transformation into a man who is comfortable in himself and has a more rounded view of the world. A lot of critics have said he finds his humanity, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Initially, right at the beginning of the play, and probably to about half to two-thirds of the way through, we see Prospero as an angry, narrowly focused man. He creates an enormous storm at the start to capture his enemies, and the Tempest is often referred to that he creates at the start is a mirror of his own mind. It's angry and it's in turmoil. He's in many ways rightfully bitter though, as about being usurped and cast adrift and the life that he's had. We learn this as he reveals his backstory through a number of retrospective speeches, and those retrospective speeches give us all that backstory about Miranda, the backstory of Ariel, the backstory of Caliban, and Shakespeare fills the narrative through Prospero's talk mainly. And that's where I'd like to start talking about how Prospero evolves, and he needs to evolve. If Shakespeare had maintained him as a character that was angry throughout, he would become boring, because he does lecture at the start of the play, and it's a very difficult thing to think about and probably a difficult role to play, is that the whole focus is on Prospero for much of the early part of the play, and as he reveals his story, it's constantly the same sort of stuff about anger and retribution and paying back, and it's very static as a character, not very theatrical at all. Early in the play, as I said, he seems angry and dominates what he does in the scenes, but by the time we get to Ferdinand, he's angry with Ferdinand as well, but he reveals his anger to the audience. And this is the beginning of him calming down in many ways and trying to create a sense of empathy with the audience. And I think that's very important to remember. It's that point there. And you might like to use that quote where he does reveal that he's not really angry with Ferdinand, he's just pretending to be angry. The other thing is, perhaps he has discovered something in himself triggered by his own conflict. Critics such as Dimkovsky suggest Prospero has a very deep inner conflict, and a lot of critics talk about, not just her, talk about his internal struggle between omnipotence and his humanity. And at the start of the play, I'd just like to go back to that again and talk about his sense of hubris in many ways, or his sense of that overwhelming power that he has and the arrogance that he has. And I think the audience discovers that but doesn't truly like it, and he needs to have that evolving sense and develop his humanity, if you want to call it that, all the way through the play. And I think as an audience we need to discover along with him, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get near the end. It's his magic at the start that makes him seem truly powerful, but not a sympathetic or a character the audience can have empathy with, as I said. He seems petty and cruel even at times, and creating the storm just to have mischief, and then the spitefulness with Caliban and all those sorts of things, and his threats to Ariel. He seems, despite his power, his all sort of omnipotent power as like a god of the island, he does seem very, very petty at times. We've talked about if Prospero evolves, the audience discovers with him through his journey. We discover through him and his reflective stories the events which are unleashed through his magic. We can discuss Prospero in terms of freedom, and what he discovers there, his own in giving freedom to others. He also discovers freedom comes through forgiveness, not retribution. This freedom is very personal in that he is forced to pursue his own interests on his return to Milan, and his forgiveness of others frees him up to do those sorts of things. He also gets a physical freedom from the play. He discovers that he can leave the island and can return to life. And finally, I think he can be free from magic, but also in a dramatic sense, he discovers the way home and the way to be free, and he asks the audience for that too, and I think that's very important. Prospero takes us, the audience, on an imaginative journey with him, and this allows us to discover with him, as I said, thus questioning our own humanity, which takes us back to those universal ideas that Shakespeare always has in the plays, even these comedies. As a final thought in regard to discovery, before I go into a lot deeper stuff and talk about some of the critics and what they say, as a final thought in regard to that is that in discovery terms, Prospero represents Shakespeare. And many critics suggest that, suggest this concept that Prospero is Shakespeare, and remembering the Tempest is Shakespeare's final play, and it's many critics have said that it's his last sort of opus about him. And usually they talk about it in terms of Prospero's magic and Shakespeare's poetic genius as being the two parallel things between them. Critics have examined this play in those sort of biographical terms, and I think it's reasonable to do that, and the discoveries we make through that are reasonably fair, especially in a postmodern sense. But it's probably not the core of his work, especially for a Shakespearean audience, and you need to keep those two ideas very separate, and context in that case, in that imparting of discovery, is very important. Now I'd like to go now and talk about what other people have said, and give you some fresh ideas and different ideas to mine about Prospero and what he discovers throughout the play. G. Wilson Knight is one of the most famous Shakespearean critics, and in his book The Crown of Life, and I suggest that you go and read the whole chapter on the Tempest that he has, because he talks about different aspects of it. Now he's very sort of what you would call now old-fashioned critic, and the books are so old that they are on public domain and you can download them for free, or you can just screen capture the pages, which is sort of what I've done here. And on page 232 of The Crown of Life, his book, and in his chapter on the Tempest, he asks the question, who is Prospero? And he goes on to give a very, very long analysis of that, and I'd just like to read a fraction of that for you to give you some idea of what he says. He says, Prospero is a man who becomes a god. Such is Prospero, who's formerly a student prince who made his court famous for the liberal arts, but was less happy in the routine of government, and therefore supplanted and rejected by his own kindred and subjects and cast adrift with his daughter. But he has established himself on an island where, in loneliness, he, with Miranda by his side, has slowly perfected his art. He has been weathered by suffering, but we scarcely speak of his character. He is scarcely a man in that way. He strikes one as being all mind. Nor can we speak properly of his dramatic situation, since he is not the slave of circumstance, but rather creates his own circumstances. Himself still in grave repose, yet radiating power like art itself, but fully purposeful like religious ritual, and yet more than these, direct action being his concern. And it goes on for several pages to talk about what we can discover about Prospero in those terms, and that it's very important to think that the discoveries made and how Prospero evolves and changes throughout the text is much of his own making and his own design, and therefore his choice. As Wilson Knight so aptly points out there, it is Prospero that drives the narrative, and the discoveries that we make are generally through Prospero. And I know there's a couple of subplots that we need to link in, but when you consider Prospero and what the discoveries are, they can be very easily linked back to the narrative, and the narrative is Prospero and his desire and his push and dreams. Okay, let's look at another couple of ideas in direct conceptualization of discovery. I'm looking at a text here by an individual called Anthony Gianotta, and he writes in the undergraduate review of Bridgewater State College in America, and he talks about the initial change in Prospero and Prospero's evolution as a character. And what we discover about Prospero, he makes very clear in this section. He says, and I quote on page 106, "Prospero's desire for vengeance to repay his usurping brother drives much of the Tempest action. His treatment of Antonio and company via Ariel throughout the play's middle acts serves as a kind of vengeance, so that by the time we reach Act 5, Prospero's character is transformed." And I'd just like to point out now, he talks here about some lines and a few points of discovery that we make on the way through. Ariel remarks how Prospero's charm so strongly works him that if he now beheld them, his affections would become tender. And that's Act 5, Scene 1, lines 17 to 19. And despite Prospero's indignation, he realises that he should favour his nobler reasons against his fury. And you'll find that quote on Act 5, Scene 1, line 26. And finally, and that rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. Another good quote that you can use from Act 5, Scene 1, 27 to 8. Shortly after Prospero specifically states he's going to take his vengeance, everything begins to turn around, and we see a lot of forgiveness in Prospero, and he forgives Caliban, he frees Ariel, he forgives Antonio, and everything comes together at the end. Those are the discoveries he makes, and in fact he finds his humanity. Continuing on from that, this author writes, "There is no doubt that Prospero undergoes a transformation. He can be regarded as vengeful up until the latter acts of the play. There are, of course, many ways to understand his transformation, but his transformation then is found at his movement towards virtue throughout the play. The tempest within Prospero quiets as the observable elements of his psyche, Ariel and Caliban, settle into harmony, each performing his own function and not interfering with the other." And that goes back to that initial concept of the drama and the idea of the tempest. And finally, to wrap up, we need to think, and we've talked about several sorts of discoveries that we make about Prospero and several ways that we make discoveries and learn things through Prospero's actions. And I'd just like to finish off talking a little bit about responsibility and how Prospero's discovers the sense of responsibility throughout the play, and that's part of his forgiveness and taking on that role of honour. And I've said here, and I'm quoting, "Prospero's denial of his own responsibility in the situation at the beginning of the play transforms into an epiphany at the end of the play, in which he realises that only through admitting his wrongs and releasing control over other people's actions can he truly be free. Therefore, the character's self-serving nature cannot be viewed as contradictory to the notion that Prospero represents selfishness, but rather reinforcement of his emotional and spiritual growth that allowed him to finally be the benevolent man that he'd always deemed himself to be." And so Prospero truly, we can say, discovers himself and discovers his humanity throughout the play. And I think that's one of the key things that you can focus on here. And that's an excellent link to your other related material, and that self-knowledge and that self-discovery are very important aspects of this play. Well, I hope that's given you some things to think about and ideas to follow up. And I think that the concept of discovery is very clear in The Tempest, and I think you'll find plenty to write about. Significantly, you'll probably only spend 2 or 3 paragraphs on Prospero, and I hope that gives you something else to talk about and some clear ideas to think about, and you can always play this and use it again. I'll sign off now. My name's Bruce Pattinson. Thank you for watching the Total Education channel. If you have any questions, please contact us through the channel. We're always here to help. Total Education is always here to serve you. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your time. Good night.